All right, my good friends, this is Mr. Davis, and we are back in action. This is your Tuesday's homework. I'm actually doing this on spring break, grinding, bumping my hump, ready to get back in action here. So we are back. You did your homework for yesterday. The worksheet is due Tuesday at 9 p.m. This lecture will be due Wednesday at 9 p.m. So when we left off World War I, what we were talking about mostly is how it became a stalemate. It had become a trench warfare. You dug your trenches and you just sat there for 4 years. At the beginning of the war was romanticized, and people eagerly jumped to the call for action to go out and fight. We also left, and the United States had not entered the war. So a lot of things are going to change. The big thing is it's not a quick war. It is not like a summer, a fall war. It's a 4-year stalemate. And the two sides, basically, it was a war of attrition. You're trying to wear the other side down. They just get dug in, and there's not much advancement. And when there's not much advancement, you just stay there, and the word that's get used a lot when it comes to World War I is a stalemate. And this is said how it baffled great military minds because they weren't used to just fighting in the same spot. And really, they're not really. I mean, they are fighting, but they're stuck, and there wasn't a lot of advancement and back and forth, because if you did try to go into the other trench, you were dead meat, for lack of better term. But there were some places where some horrible battles took place. This was in France. This is the Battle of Verdun. Verdun is right here, very close to Belgium, close to Germany. In 1916, so it's halfway through the war, German forces focused on one strategic spot, Verdun. The French refused to give up this spot. What was horrific, and I might have covered a few slides of this before, so this might be a little bit of redundancy, but that's okay. We've been off for 2 weeks. What's crazy about this is that the French lost 400,000 troops. The Germans lost 350,000. That is 750,000 people. Either got killed or were wounded that they could never fight again. In three months, they were fighting there. No ground was made on either side. It's like one of those soccer games when people get mad about soccer because they can end in ties. Like, this ends in a tie. Yet 750,000 people die or wounded. And you could say maybe the French were worse on the French because they lost 50,000 more people. These were bones that have been collected from out here in the battlefield. And this is a French cemetery out in Verdun. So they have all kinds of troops buried out there in this graveyard. So if you believe in hauntings, is one of the most haunted places in the world, compared to if you ask for like somebody that devotes their life to like studying paranormal activity, which I do not. All right, so another thing that changes. Now, this is very different in World War I than World War II. Just like it's different from World War I to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. By the end of 1915, airplanes began showing up in wars. This is the first time in history. We are just past Orville and Wilbur Wright. You could find enemy positions. You can attack ground targets, but literally, like, it is a very infancy. Like, literally, like, the pilots would be carrying a pistol and sometimes shooting with a pistol out of their cockpit. So it's not like the unmanned drones that we fly to drop bombs today. Some of the biggest targets we hit today are with unmanned drones. It's somebody in Washington or somewhere else. It's almost like playing a video game, except for the fact it's real human lives you're talking about putting in danger. But so it's very different, the infancy. If you remember the video of Wilbur and Orville Wright, like how, simplistic their plane looked like back then. Of course, it was cutting edge. It will change greatly. German airships were called Zeppelin, so you hear the term Led Zeppelin. These were big, basically blimps, and used to bomb London. Because of the stalemate, they did focus on trying to improve their air warfare capabilities, because that was one way that they could attack the other side, get past the no man's land, was through air. They also started building tanks. So you're going to see tanks becoming a major weapon in warfare, as well as like a shield, so to speak. And you're going to see some different fronts. The one front was called the Balkan Front. That was down the Balkan Peninsula. That was interesting. Wish I had a map here, but the Balkan Front, that's where the whole war basically got started with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. Starts down in the Balkans, and that was sometimes it was called the soft underbelly of Europe, and that was a way to kind of penetrate into the German line. Italy. So Italy in World War One is an Allied member. Says in return for Italy entering the war on the Allied side, France and Great Britain promised to let Italy have some of Austrian territory. So they take up a front against Austria-Hungary. By 1917, the war had truly become a world war. This is similar to the 7 Years' War when France and Great Britain were fighting all over the world, except for the fact that was, can make an argument that was mainly two countries. This is all kinds of countries battling one another. Great Britain also sends troops into the Middle East. They start taking Germany's colonies because the Germans, this is just like basically, you leave your front door wide open, you run out of your house in a panic, and your burglars can come in because you have attention somewhere else. And that's kind of, the Germans couldn't defend their house. They couldn't defend their kingdom. So the Allied troops started kind of sucker punching them, so to speak, hitting them where they're not looking, and started taking their colonies because it was very profitable to have colonies because that's where you got your raw materials to produce things in a lot of terms. All right, so this was a total war. Like I said in the intro to this, many people expected this to be a quick, short war. If you remember way back, the Kaiser said, "Be back before the leaves fall from the trees." Basically, the war starts in full-fledged August 2nd, 1914. And be back before the leaves fall from the trees means like be back in a few months. Okay, this is going to go on for 4 years, over 4 years. Governments had to respond quickly if machines failed to achieve their goals. They took over the economies. Capitalism, believe it or not, was kind of briefly put aside. You can draw some comparisons to what is going on today, what was going on in World War One. A lot of people are, I'm not saying I'm pro this, anti this, but a lot of people are kind of getting a little bit frustrated being in their house all the time and being told what they can do, who they can't see, etc. Like one of the big things in Kentucky people are mad about is, some churches were allowing you to drive to the church and hear your preacher, your priest. I don't think it was a Catholic church, but different churches were having like some type of ceremony over a loudspeaker and where you drove to the parking lot. And the governor said, if you do that, even if you drive to the parking lot, sit in your car, we're going to take down your license plate and we're going to quarantine you. So that is something where people are saying that that's kind of an overreach. And why they say they can do it is because they're comparing the coronavirus to a war. And you see that in wartime where the government takes over certain parts of the society and they chalk it up to, we're doing this because we're at war. And so you're seeing that a lot in our country today. So new economies, government set up price wages, rent control prices, they ration food supplies. Again, this is stuff you see today. You cannot price gouge. You can never price gouge. What I mean by that is like the coronavirus, everybody wants toilet paper. Myers can't sell toilet paper for $20 a roll compared to $1 a roll. Rationing food supplies. I've seen a lot on the news about our food production and people, farmers being hurt by COVID-19, etc. So you do see in times of war, the government is going to step in and say, this is for the greater good, is the term you hear a lot of. They took over transportation systems. They planned economies. So in the United States, now we are not quite in the war at this point. Yeah, we're not going to get there until about 1917. Um, in a total war, the line gets blurred between soldier and civilian. Now, who was leading our country? Our country is led by this man right here, Woodrow Wilson. He was a very educated man. He's a very smart man that you might say, like, that's pretty stupid, Mr. Davis. Everybody that runs for president is very smart. He was an academic. He was the president of Princeton University before he became the president. He did not believe in war. His slogan, his reelection, he was elected in 1912. He ran against Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 and won. And then his reelection campaign, like, he went out of his way to keep us out of war so that really he could use that slogan. In 1916, his slogan was, "He kept us out of war." And so if I asked my good friend Parker Lozier, what group of people was he courting to vote for him in 1916? If I said, what ethnic background, what group of Americans does he want to vote for him? And I asked Parker, and he would tell me, very good, great job, Parker, the Germans. So the Germans did not want German Americans, I would say, did not want the Americans going to war against their motherland. So he's very educated. He was a Democrat, and he kept us out of war for the time being. You see this. This is another form of propaganda. Citizens began to grow weary of the war. They thought this was going to be a quick war, and it was not, certainly not a quick war. Morale was beginning to crack. Governments fought hard against opposition to the war, and people, they didn't expect this. The 1800s, after Napoleon, was very peaceful in the world. Now, obviously, 1861 to 1865, we have the Civil War going on, but as far as globally, this was kind of a somewhat peaceful, like, as far as battling each other. There was some really bad things that the Europeans did against other nations, like where they gobbled up territory and they put natives to work in Africa and India, etc. But as far as global war, there wasn't a lot of war going on. So this long period of time when John and Joe aren't coming home from the front lines to see Sally and Susie, people start getting pretty frustrated with it. And again, you see in wartime, government do things that they normally wouldn't. It said in Britain, you could actually get arrested just for protesting, being anti-war. This was a British publication and says, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" It says his son is playing with the toy soldiers down here, and his daughter is looking at this book about the war. He's kind of thinking. So some people have interpreted this painting two different ways. I interpreted that this guy didn't go to war. He's trying to explain why he didn't go to war when Uncle Johnny died in war, or the neighbor down the street went to war and was a hero. Other people have interpreted it another way, as saying he saw some terrible things in war, and how's he going to put it in perspective to a little 4-year-old girl? So that's one way to interpret it. I know when I asked my dad about Vietnam, he doesn't like come out and say all the crazy things that happened while he was there and that he saw. But I do know he was in a very terrible battle called the Battle of Hamburger Hill, and where both sides, this guys got slaughtered. But it's not something that we talk about. Very much. He told me when he was over there what battles he was in, but as far as what he saw, it really haven't opened up that can of experiences. So you could interpret that two different ways. Total war on women. This is American propaganda. So women were asked to take over jobs men had left, but jobs were far from secure. Basically, when the men came back, they got their job back. So there's no coincidence here that 1919 and 1920, American women get the right to vote in 1920. So the World War I did help American women prove, hey, we can do this, and then they're going to get the right to vote. Interesting, though, right, with the right to vote, we know prohibition comes in at that same time, which is kind of interesting. They were connected. Okay, so let's talk about the trauma of war here. This is back in this time period, they were calling it right here shell shock. Today, the four-letter term that we would describe war, if I ask my good friend Anna Banana Scharf, what four-letter word do we talk about when we use kind of comparing shell shock to this? Four-letter acronym, 4 words. You're right, Anna. Great job. PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they didn't really have the science, and especially the clinicians and psychologists that could deal with shell shock like we do today. But even with all the experience, all the medical depression, anti-anxiety medication we have, the suicide rate for soldiers in America today is astronomical compared to the rest of the population. It is horrible. It's sometimes they call it the hidden enemy of soldiers coming back and killing themselves after being involved in war, especially today with how many tours of duty some people get. So it's a very serious situation. I'm not going to get into it in depth right now, but they had the same situation going on back then. And just think about going off to war, seeing these horrors of war, and then getting back to normal everyday life. And think about, some losing your buddies out in the battlefield and then just getting back to normal. So soldiers really had to fight this invisible enemy when they get home. In Britain, they had to deal with 80,000 cases of shell shock. So this is really hard to deal with for societies after the war. We will save this for later. I am going to show you now this video about air warfare. So let me get here. Okay, so this is called The War in the Skies.
In 1914, the Wright brothers had made the world's first powered flight only a decade earlier, and the airplane was still in its infancy. But the remarkable advances made in aviation during World War I are still the core of air power today. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about the war in the air. Now, to say the first planes used in the war were basic is an understatement. Cockpits were open, and instruments were rudimentary. There were no navigational aids, and pilots had to rely on whatever maps could be found, which might even be a school atlas or a road map. Getting lost was commonplace, and landing in a field to ask directions was not unusual, as was flying low alongside railway lines, hoping to read station names on the platforms. But throughout the war, there was an upward spiral of technological developments, as first one side and then the other gained the advantage, and ever more effective aircraft replaced the basic machines that took to the skies in 1914. The first airplanes were not seen as offensive weapons, but as scouts. Even at the end of the war, the fighter types, such as the Sopwith Snipe and Fokker D-8, were still classified as scouts. Men on horseback were used traditionally to scout out the enemy's position, but they had obvious limitations, while the scout planes had a greater freedom of movement, a much wider range of operation, and the unparalleled speed to accomplish these missions. And aerial photography became a vital operation for both sides during the war. This was a continuation of the successful use in earlier conflicts of tethered, lighter-than-air balloons for reconnaissance, such as those used in the American Civil War. But flying reconnaissance missions was dangerous. The pilot was required to fly straight and level to allow the observer to take a series of overlapping photographs, and there was no better target for anti-aircraft guns or stalking fighters. And long-range reconnaissance meant flying well behind the front lines. Perhaps the best reconnaissance plane of the war was the Italian Ansaldo SVA-5. This plane, produced in both single-seater and two-seater variants, had a range and altitude allowing it to cross the Alps. And with a top speed of 230 kilometers per hour, it could fly fast enough to outrun enemy fighters. And here's a little side note. It was more important, if less romantic, for a fighter pilot to shoot down an observation plane than to shoot down another fighter. More than half of Manfred von Richthofen's record-setting 80 victories were scored against reconnaissance and observation planes. When war broke out, the number of aircraft in use was tiny. France, for example, had fewer than 140 aircraft at the start of the war. By the end of the war, she fielded 4,500 aircraft, more than any other protagonist. This may not seem like too much, but it doesn't give the true indication of the amount of aircraft involved. During the war, France produced no less than 68,000 aircraft. 52,000 of them were lost in battle, for a loss rate of 77%. The period between 1914 and 1918 saw not only tremendous production, but also tremendous development in aircraft technology. A typical British aircraft at the outbreak of the war was the general-purpose BE-2C, with a top speed of 116 kilometers per hour. Powered by a 90-horsepower engine, it could remain aloft for over 3 hours. 3 years later, the SE-5A fighter was powered by a 200-horsepower engine and had a top speed of 222 kilometers per hour, nearly twice as fast. Britain's most famous bomber, the Handley Page 0400, could carry a bomb load of 900 kilograms at a top speed of 156 kilometers per hour for flights lasting 8 hours. It was powered by two 360-horsepower engines. In 1914, it was important that aircraft be easy to fly, as the amount of training that pilots received was minimal, to say the least. Some pilots began flying combat missions having completed only 3.5 hours of actual flying time. For this reason, aircraft were designed for stability, but by the end of the war, stability had given way to maneuverability. The famous Sopwith Camel was, for example, a difficult aircraft to fly, but supremely agile. Many earlier common technologies became obsolete as the war progressed. Like, a lot of the aircraft in 1914 were of pusher layout. This is the same configuration that the Wright brothers used, where the propeller faced backwards and pushed the aircraft forward. The alternative layout, where the propeller faces forwards and pulls the aircraft, was called a tractor design. It provided better performance, but in 1914, visibility was deemed more important than speed. World War I marked the end of pusher aircraft. Now, as early as 1912, designers at the British firm Vickers were experimenting with machine gun carrying aircraft. The first concrete result was the Vickers Experimental Fighting Biplane 1. This was a pusher type of plane. This provided an optimal machine gun position from which the gun could be fired directly forward without an obstructing propeller, and also reloaded and cleared in flight. An important drawback was that pusher designs had inferior performance to tractor types. They were simply too slow to catch their quarry. So there was an obvious need for some means to fire a machine gun forward from a tractor aircraft. It would seem most natural to place the gun between the pilot and the propeller, firing in the direct line of flight, so the gun could be aimed by aiming the aircraft. It was also important that the breech of the weapon be readily accessible to the pilot so that he could clear the jams and stoppages to which early machine guns were prone. However, this presented an obvious problem. A percentage of bullets fired free through a revolving propeller will strike the blades, with predictable results. The Morane-Saulnier company designed a system of deflector blades, metal wedges on the propeller. Roland Garros tried out this system in April 1915. He managed to score several kills before being forced by engine failure, possibly caused by the repeated strain on his aircraft's crankshaft from the deflected bullets, to land behind enemy lines, where he and his plane were captured. The German High Command passed Garros' captured plane to the Fokker Company with orders to copy the design. The deflector system, though, was totally unsuitable for the steel-jacketed German ammunition, so the Fokker engineers finally came up with a machine gun that was synchronized with the propeller by using interrupter gear. They produced the Eindecker series of planes, and crude as these little monoplanes were, they gave a period of German air superiority, known as the Fokker Scourge by the Allies. The psychological effect exceeded the material. The Allies had up to now been more or less unchallenged in the air, and the vulnerability of their older reconnaissance aircraft, especially the British BE-2 and French Farman pushers, came as a very nasty shock. Everybody knows about flying aces, right? The dashing and daring heroes of their homelands. Here are the greatest aces of the war. Manfred von Richthofen, German, 80 victories, also known as the Red Baron. Ernst Udet, German, 62 victories, also famous for using a parachute to survive being shot down. McManus, British, 73 victories, the most victories of any British ace, although some of his kills are now disputed, in which case that honor falls to Billy Bishop, Canadian ace, 72 victories, and René Fonck, French, 75 victories, the most victories of any Allied ace. So there you have it, a brief introduction to the war in the air. It was during this period that the key tasks that aircraft could perform were experimented with and refined. Observation and reconnaissance, tactical and strategic bombing, ground attack, naval warfare, and with the growing importance and influence of aircraft came the need to control the air, and thus the fighter was born. Brigadier General Billy Mitchell put it very well, quote, "The day has passed when armies on the ground or navies on the sea can be the arbiter of a nation's destiny in war. The main power of defense and the power of initiative against an enemy has passed to the air," end quote. We will, of course, do future specials on flying aces and the actual planes used in combat. And also, we'll have features and links about aircraft of the war on our Facebook page. You can also see our bio special on the Red Baron right here. See you Thursday with our regular episode.
All right, so that will be that there. So we will finish off here with that video. We are going to start up talking about why the United States got in and the end of the war, etc. On a later video. But I hope you enjoyed that video. It's kind of cool, some cool stuff in there in this lecture. We will stop here, and that will be it for today. So take care.